I love what you guys are doing because, again, like what you said, storytelling, a lot of it is engaging a community and you're building it as you go along.
Yes.
Now you're also calling for others to also submit their recipes over to you via Instagram as well as email, right?
Yes, yes, of course. At the start, we were like, what if, when we were innovating on the business, right? Like, what if people just don't buy because they don't know how to use the vegetables, right? Especially when you have more niche products, things like ice plant or Swiss chard that you don't usually find in the supermarket. Finding nice recipes that would fit the palate that people would enjoy doing, or just showcasing how beautiful it can be. I think that's always a nice touch. And for that reason, we also maintain very, very close touch with our customers, finding out what we can do better and how we can value add, what kind of content they want to see, what kind of products they want to see as well.
Can you tell us one of the weirdest but yet the best, the nicest recipes you've probably found?
I remember there was a period of time when we first started selling kale. There were like 6 or 7 variations of kale chips, and I love it because turning vegetables into a snack. It's something that everyone can do. But then you realize that there were so many variations of how people tune the air fryer, how much oil they put, how they keep it crispy. So I really, really enjoyed that. Although there are some really cool recipes, check it out on the blog. But I really enjoyed the fact that so many people were getting on board the kale chips train. And there were so many ways to make kale chips. And they were like, oh, you should put this oil instead of that oil, so that it stays crispy. And how do you sort of prepare the air fryer in different ways so that you can minimize mess? Yeah, that was good fun.
Oh, okay. So it's like you get a lot of more information and in-depth kind of tips to finesse the whole thing.
100%, 100%. Even when it comes to, like, sometimes we learn from our customers, like, they found a new way to, use parts of the vegetables that they previously didn't use. I remember, so we have an in-house chef who prepares the the hot sauce and the pesto, right? And we realized that people like Swiss chard. They like the leaves, right? But the stems are quite hard to eat. So what he did one day was he pickled the stems, and he turned Swiss chard stems into these nice little pickles that can be had with different things as well. So I think that's that continuous having fun with it, and that's always part of the process.
Oh, very nice, very nice. I mean, even broccoli stems, right? They were actually wasted
100%.
quite a lot. We're always used to taking the florets and everything, but the broccoli stem can be eaten if you boil them and salt them nicely.
100%.
Everything's good. Yeah. So it's really cool that you have all this. So, ladies and gentlemen, whoever is listening out there or watching, head on down to Urban Tiller SG. Go check out the blog, get the recipes in, and if you got your own, also submit them. Okay. Now moving forward, Jolene and I were planning this a little bit, and one of the things that we do want to tackle right now is this thing of sustainable farming and ultimately, right, how do you truly support local farms and produce? Is it really about something that we go down to the farm and actually buy them ourselves, or do we just buy anything off our local grocers or supermarkets that said made in Singapore? Is that how you truly support the local farm and produce?
So that's a big question, and I like to think about that question from the point of view of how widely accessible is it, and how mainstream can it go, right? So going down to a farm is great, and like buying produce from there is great. Although a lot of the farms in Singapore may not be as bucolic as you imagine in your head, right? Like you can't just go down and it's an open farm. A lot of the farms that are licensed in Singapore, there are a lot of new farms that are actually inside buildings, and they look a lot more like a science lab or like a
Mm.
clean room than an open field where your kids can run around. In fact, you would probably not allowed to you're not allowed to run around because of all the equipment and things that are set up. It's great. I think going direct to a farm is great. But I think one of the things that we noticed about consumers, is ultimately how do you make impact at scale, right? And how do you scale access to a lot of these farms and produce? So one of the things is that, yeah, like what you mentioned, right? It seems like a very good idea, when it comes to let's go down to a farm and let's buy produce directly from them and support them. For the average consumer, if you think about a salad that you eat, right, that you get at any of your CBD salad joints, you might have lettuce, kale, like chard, cherry tomatoes, toppings, meat, everything. Could you get all of that from one farm? The answer is probably no. So when I was talking to a lot of people in the space, what became clear was that a lot of small to mid-sized farms, they usually specialize in 1 to 2 kinds of produce, maybe a maximum of 4 to 5. So the question for the consumer is, okay, am I willing to drive down or take public transport down to a farm and realize that the only thing I can buy from them is kale or is lettuce, right? There's always that urge that, okay, I can go to the farm and get this, but then I need to go to the supermarket anyway and go get everything else that is going to be on my dinner plate that day. And I think the central focus of Urban Tiller is, okay, there needs to be aggregation, because it doesn't make sense for a farm to, let's say, go directly to consumer and only have 1 or 2 products on offer. What our hope was to do was to make sure that these produce types could provide a full assortment of what people needed, and as a result become sustainable for the consumer and for us as a business. Because I think that's super important when it comes to thinking about what is the long-term sustainability of a business model like that, right? And which is why I like to think about sustainability, not just in terms of, okay, not using a plastic bag, but really sort of like longevity of consumer choices, consumer lifestyles, and at the end of the day, sustainability of relationships that you have with people, right? If, let's say, there's a farm who's supplying to any supplier, and that kind of consistency is really the one thing that manages to keep a farm alive economically, and keeps them sustainable, right? There were I mean, when I started out, there were a few farms who I met, and there are some horror stories about how supermarkets can just overnight decide that they are not going to take a certain amount of produce the next day, but you've been growing it for 3 months for them, right? So then you have a whole bunch of stuff in your farm, and your off-taker was not going to take it. What are you going to do with it, right? And creating it's financial loss, but it's also a loss of time, and a waste of food. So I think what we are trying to do is also to focus on long-term consistent survivability of players like that as well. So you going up to a farm is great. On that day you buy like 1 kilo, 2 kilos of vegetables, and then you don't come back for 2 months, right? What happens then? So I think it's always that consistency as well. And the second part of it is what I said just now about accessibility. You and I might be able to, let's say, drive down to a farm for a day and buy whatever we want. But not everyone can do that, right? For a lot of people, for reasons of time, money, accessibility, that's just not an option, right? There still needs to be something that's made accessible, that's made easy. And the truth is, a lot of local farms, there's a central question to why should we support a farm just because it's local, right? And that conversation extends. It's okay, I understand that eating as local as possible helps me reduce food waste along international supply chains and the carbon emissions of bringing something all the way from somewhere else. But also, okay, if it's grown in an urban farm, people have questions about, oh yeah, but it's growing in aircon and in lights. How is that more sustainable, right, than growing something out in an open field? Well, that takes debate. That takes sort of like a lot of understanding. So for us at Urban Tiller, a lot of the goals that we try to do is try to achieve up to 90% of water savings when it comes to water use compared to conventional agriculture, and making sure that in a controlled environment, you're actually able to keep your food cleaner and safer, because if you grow in a good controlled environment, you actually don't need pesticides. You don't need to spray excessive chemicals. You don't need to sort of clean the environment is kept clean for you in that sense, right? Of course, questions of things like, oh yeah, electricity for the lights, electricity for the aircon, electricity for, keeping everything clean. It's a balance, right? It's a balance of how are you going to feed billions of people by, the next 5 to 10 years, and what resource is more scarce, right? And that's generally a big question. So for us, there's an understanding that, okay, so there are certain things that have to change about how we produce our food. But then there's also the big question, right, of how much does it cost, right? So the truth is, some kinds of produce grown outdoors in the conventional way, like, whatever you might see in Cameron Highlands or an open farm, growing it indoors in an urban smart farming setting can cost up to 10 to 20 times more, which is a very dramatic change in cost of production. If you think about how much you pay as a consumer, right, and how much you're used to pay, willing to pay, can afford to pay. Do we need to pay that much for food? I think that's not the right question to ask. The right question to ask is, what is the true cost of food? And in order to be sustainable, is there a price that we also have to pay? And how do we mitigate that, or how do we sort of make it more amenable and more sustainable to really achieve certain outcomes that justify a certain cost?